Welcome to Face Toward Zion. As part of the Come Follow Me curriculum for January 6th through the 12th, I would like to discuss the story of Nephi and Laban. This will cover 1 Nephi chapters 3 and 4 and quite a bit of chapter 7. To begin, I'd like to tell a personal story. As a young man, I was called to serve in the Chile Concepcion mission. Near the end of my mission, I was transferred to Concepcion and served in the area containing the University of Concepcion. The picture you see is the entrance into the university. It is called the Ark of Medicine. I remember going under this Arco de Medicina numerous times. Living close to the university was a challenge because there was a lot of students. Instead of living in apartments, you would live in homes that had extra rooms. With that many students, it was hard to find the right home. We were able to find a home that had some students, and there was also an older daughter of the mamacita of the home and her husband. I say older because they were like 25 or 26. When you're 19 or 20, then 25 or 26 is really old. It's all a matter of perspective. One evening we were sitting around the dinner table and this older girl said, "You guys are missionaries, aren't you? I would be interested to learn more about your church." Well, those are golden words to a missionary. There were some unwritten rules on talking about religion with people in your pension, as there were stories of missionaries offending the family and coming home to see all of their possessions thrown out on the street because the family was offended from what was said. Still, anytime someone shows interest, you are more than happy to discuss the gospel. I told her that what we do is meet with people and discuss with them our beliefs. She said she was really busy and didn't really want to have a formal discussion, but wanted to read something. I told her we had some really good pamphlets on Joseph Smith and the Plan of Salvation. But she said she didn't want to read a pamphlet. She wanted to read a book. I thought, what book do we have? Oh yeah, the Book of Mormon. I told her about the book and she said, yeah, she would like to read it. Oh, and I just happened to have an extra copy. I went to our room and got a book. As I handed her the book, I bore my testimony that the reason I had left my home for 2 years was because of this book. It is really powerful and will teach you about Jesus Christ. She seemed touched and said she would read it. She also said she was really busy with school and work, and to give her a while before we talked about it again. I agreed. Time went by. A couple of weeks, then a month and a half. One evening I just thought I would ask her about it, and so I said, "Have you been able to read any of the book?" She apologized, saying that she was really busy, but that she had read a bit of the book. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I read just enough to know that you are communists. I didn't know you were a communist church." The room went silent. My companion gave me that look of, "Okay, this one's all yours, elder." The only sound was my jaw hitting the floor. I tried to recover and I said, "Excuse me? We are not a communist church. Why would you get that impression?" And then she literally quoted 1 Nephi 4:13. "It is better that one man should perish than a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief." She quoted that and looked at me. I was like, "And why does that mean we're communists?" Then she explained. In a free society, the government exists for the individual, and the individual has all rights. In a communist society, the government has all rights over the individual. In a communist society, if one person is doing something to hurt the government, then it is okay to eliminate that individual to help the greater society. So Laban was eliminated for the better of society. That means we're a communist church, right? So are we communists? There's some history with this question that the average American in 2020 may not know, but I knew about this at that time. Let me explain. In 1970, Chile held a presidential election. There were 3 main parties and the vote was split. A gentleman named Salvador Allende was elected as president with 36% of the popular vote. Allende ran on the Democratic Socialist ticket. I don't want to delve too deep into politics, but it's important that we understand history and understand what happened. He ran on a ticket of that it's not fair, that there are rich people and some people have little or nothing. It's only fair that money is taken from the wealthy and given to the poor. Allende's ticket was that he would tax the rich and even nationalize businesses so the business owners would not get all the profits, and then give those profits to the workers. He began with the platform to raise the minimum wage and provide everyone with a government job. That would lift the poor out of poverty. After he won, he started to implement these promises. Minimum wage was raised and everyone was given a government job. The average wage started to increase. If you take the average wage of a Chilean in 1970 as 100%, then by 1972 the average wage had risen to almost 130. His reforms were taking place. People were now to work and they could buy things that they couldn't before. Now supply and demand says that if demand goes up and the supply stays the same, what happens to the price? It goes up. So inflation became a real issue. The government began to take on debt. To pay for this, they began to nationalize industries. First came the copper mine and then the banks. However, they still couldn't make enough to keep up with their debt. With inflation starting to rise, the government set prices for everything. Let's say that they set the price of a gallon of milk at $4. If you owned a store, you could now only charge $4, but the demand was outstripping supply. So what started to happen? The store owner would take that gallon of milk and sell it out the back door for $5 or $6. The black market started to prosper. Goods started to become scarce, and that drove the price up even more. Within a year, inflation had risen by 140%. The government was now taking on more and more debt. In a move that was criticized, Allende told foreign governments that debt taken on by a former administration would no longer be honored. That highly devalued the Chilean peso, and inflation began to accelerate even faster. Truckers now became a focus. They had the goods but were being so regulated they couldn't make enough to keep up with inflation, so they went on strike. The banks went on strike. Now instead of this prosperity, people were starting to starve. Riots began focused against the government. Allende could no longer deliver on his promises. What was to happen? Well, on September 11th, 1973, an interesting date, don't you think? That is 9/11. In 1973, a gentleman by the name of Augusto Pinochet, who was the commander of the armed forces, staged a coup and declared their constitution as invalid and established a military junta. Aided by what many say was the CIA, remember, we didn't want socialism established on the Western Hemisphere, they attacked the building housing Allende. The story goes that Allende committed suicide using an AK-47 that was gifted to him by his good friend, Fidel Castro. Pinochet tried to stabilize the Chilean economy and privatized the nationalized businesses of Allende. Of course, those close to him seemed to profit the most. He ruled with an iron fist. You didn't want to oppose him, and you didn't want to see a communist. There are stories of those who revolted that they would be arrested at night and then never heard from again. In 1982, a movie was made on this titled Missing and starred Sissy Spacek and Jack Lemmon. It told of an American journalist who became missing. The movie won an Academy Award for Best Writing and was nominated for Best Picture and Best Actor and Best Actress. It was a good movie, again titled Missing, and was released in 1982. With this background and living under the military rule of Augusto Pinochet, how would you answer that question? Are we communists? One more piece of information that I also knew at that time. In 1979, then President of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Ezra Taft Benson, had served as the Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight D. Eisenhower and was part of post-war Europe. He had seen the impact firsthand of Nazism and communism. In October 1979 General Conference, he gave a talk titled A Witness and a Warning. In that talk, he said, "Communism introduced into the world a substitute for true religion. It is a counterfeit of the gospel plan. The false prophets of communism predict a utopian society. This, they proclaim, will only be brought about as capitalism and free enterprise are overthrown, private property abolished, the family as a social unit eliminated, all classes abolished, all governments overthrown, and a communal ownership of property in a classless, stateless society established." The talk's a fascinating talk and shows the power of political corruption. He also quoted the first presidency in 1936. They said, "Communism is not a political party nor a political plan under the Constitution. It is a system of government that is the opposite of our constitutional government. We call upon all church members completely to eschew communism. The safety of our divinely inspired constitutional government and the welfare of our church imperatively demand that communism shall have no place in America. So how would you have responded to that question? So, why did Nephi have to kill Laban? I don't remember all that I said in the ensuing conversation, but needless to say, she wasn't baptized. When I returned home, I continued to meditate on this question. How should I have responded? What should I have said? A few years later, I ran across an article by Eugene England titled, Why Nephi Killed Laban, Reflections on the Truth of the Book of Mormon. I love Eugene England as an author and find his work very thought-provoking, but I remember thinking after I read that article, that really doesn't answer the question of why Nephi had to kill Laban. As I searched, I found more and more articles that reference this topic. Some of them are listed here. Still, I don't think any of them answered this question, so I sent out to answer this question. What I have found is that, bottom line, Nephi was commanded and he obeyed. Ultimately, that is what we all must do. When commanded, we obey. Sometimes we don't have enough time to get all the answers. Sometimes you just have to obey and move on. Still, I think it's okay to look back and try to find the answer to this question. The first point I realized is, how sure do you have to be before taking someone's life? I think you better truly understand the spirit. There are bad examples. Mountain Meadows Massacre. Remember, John D. Lee was later executed due to that decision. We are often hesitant to talk about this dark episode in our history, but I think there are things we can learn. There's the story of Dan and Ron Lafferty. If you're not familiar with their story, in 1984 they formed an extremist polygamous group, and when their sister-in-law would not join their group, Dan and Ron killed her and her 15-month-old daughter. They said that God told them to do that. Clearly God did not do that, and they were illusional. Then there is the story of Abraham and Isaac. The father of the Abrahamic covenant was willing to kill his son. Fortunately, he didn't have to do that, but that story has intrigued many for thousands of years. Ultimately, in 1 Nephi, the Lord indicated that the family needed the brass plates, that we may preserve unto our children the language of our fathers, and also that we may preserve unto them the words which have been spoken by the mouth of all the holy prophets, which have been delivered unto them by the Spirit and power of God since the world began, even down unto the present time. The Lehi family needed the brass plates. Did Nephi kill Laban ultimately to get the plates? If all he needed was the plates, then why did he have to kill Laban? Couldn't he have gotten the plates another way? For example, later in the Book of Mormon, the Lord causes a deep sleep to fall upon the Lamanite guards, allowing the Nephites to take the city. Why couldn't the Lord have caused Laban to fall into a deep sleep? Nephi could have removed his armor, gone to Zoram like he did, and he still could have retrieved the plates. Another scenario could have been that Laban just have a heart attack or die of natural causes. Nephi could have gotten the plates without having to kill Laban, but he was commanded to, and he did. Why? I've heard it said that Nephi needed to learn something. Really, is there any lesson that we can learn that justifies in taking a life? I don't think so. I've heard it said that since Laban tried to kill the brothers, that he was now justified, per Mosaic law, to go ahead and kill Laban. I think you have to be careful going down that path. Using that logic, would you not be able to justify pretty much anything that you want to do? It is easy to justify things. I think the answer lies into first reviewing the story. Remember, first they drew lots to determine who would go into Laban. That lot fell upon Laman. Was that truly by chance, or did the Lord have his hand in that? Second, they tried to buy the plates. That didn't work too well either. Finally, the third try, the rule of three, Nephi goes by the Spirit. Verse 29 says, Behold, ye shall go up to Jerusalem again, and the Lord will deliver Laban into your hands. I find it interesting that it doesn't say go and the Lord will get you the plates. It says he will deliver Laban into your hands. Often scriptures are interesting in what they don't say as much as what they do say. We don't have the rest of the story, but I don't think it's too hard to surmise on what happened. First, I imagine if you cut off someone's head, it's a pretty messy scene. I don't think the authorities need to conduct an autopsy to determine the cause of the death. It was pretty straightforward. His head was cut off. Someone had to have done that. Don't you imagine that the next day that was the talk of the town? I'd bet that even without texting and Twitter, that by 10 o'clock in the morning, everyone in Jerusalem knew the story. Suppose you were the chief of police in Jerusalem that morning. What would you do? You would want to solve that case pretty quick. But who were the chief suspects? Of course, we know it was Nephi, but that is just because we know the story. The chief of police wouldn't have had this information. Who would be the chief suspect? It wouldn't take too much investigation. You would find out Zoram was conveniently missing. I'd bet that if you could find Zoram, you could probably find some answers. They may not immediately know that the plates were missing, so you may have to look at other suspects. We don't know, but I would bet that there would be a dozen or so suspects who probably wouldn't have minded to have Laban gone. I doubt he was always honest in his dealings, and he probably had some enemies somewhere. Finally, they would find out that the plates were missing. Again, Zoram would be the main culprit, but the chief would probably learn the story of Lehi's sons. Once you know the story, a main suspect would be Laban. Why Laban? Well, who had gone in all by himself the first time to ask for the plates? That was Laban. If you were the chief, you wouldn't know the story about the lottery. All you would know is that Laban went in first. You may assume that since he was the oldest, then his brothers would do things at his bidding. Nephi would be part of the group, but again, if you could find Laban, you could get some answers. Suppose Laban and Lemuel had returned to Jerusalem and given themselves up to the authorities. What would Laban have said? Oh yeah, I know who killed Laban. It was my little brother. Would that excuse have been sufficient? You know what would have happened. They would have said, then, where is Nephi? Laban would have responded, he's out camping with the rest of the family. The authorities would have wanted Laban to have taken them there. But by the time they got there, they would be gone. After not being able to find them, do you think they would just let Laban walk free? You had a suspect with first-hand knowledge of the crime and was part of the party. Do you just let him go free? I don't think so. So what did happen? They returned to get Ishmael's family. This is chapter 7. I don't think they just walked in the middle of the night and said, hey, we're here. I'm sure they had to sneak in at night. And who did the talking with Ishmael? Would it have been the little brother Nephi or the heir apparent Laban? Chapter 7 verse 4 says, and we did gain favor in the sight of Ishmael, insomuch that we did speak unto him the words of the Lord. We probably means Laban and the rest of the brothers went along with it. Laban was probably running things. Then what happens? On the way back, Laban and Lemuel, two of the daughters of Ishmael, I don't think it's too extreme to assume that two daughters to go along with this were the ones closest in age to Laban and Lemuel and the ones that they would eventually marry, and the two sons of Ishmael rebel against Nephi and start to beat up on their little brother. What happens to little brothers? They always get beat up on. Ask any little brother and they will tell you that. The reason for their rebellion is verse 7. They wanted to go back to Jerusalem, and why not? Lehi still had property and pretty significant possessions that wouldn't have been lost to Laban. And Ishmael still had all of his possessions. A good living is still sitting in Jerusalem if they were to return. Why did they get mad at Nephi, and why didn't they just return? The answer is because it was Nephi who had killed Laban. Ultimately, Laban and Lemuel were wanted men. They couldn't just go back. Laban and Lemuel knew this. All would have worked out for them if it hadn't been that their little brother Nephi had killed Laban. This line of reasoning follows in chapter 7. In verse 15, Nephi makes the barbed statement, if ye have choice. The problem is, they don't really have the choice. So they do the next best thing. They beat up their little brother. Finally, it is interesting that in verse 19, that one of Ishmael's daughters and one of his sons realize that this has gone too far, and they just talk some sense into Laban and Lemuel. So a valid question is, what would have happened had Nephi not killed Laban? Well, Laban and Lemuel would have returned to Jerusalem. Without Laban being dead, they would have smoothed things over somehow. But then what would have happened? Once Lehi's family made it to America, then there would not have been this division among their society. Remember the story of the Jaredites. They didn't have a division with one faction being righteous and the other wicked, and they were utterly destroyed. No one was left. If all of the Nephites had been destroyed, then there wouldn't be a group of people or a remnant who survived. Remember the prophecies of the remnant. Watch as we go through the Book of Mormon and note the many prophecies of this remnant. Without this remnant, then they couldn't come forth in the latter days. We don't know what all will happen, but they could save us one day. It's in the Book of Mormon. Remember that this remnant is of the bloodline of the house of Israel. This will play a factor someday. But none of this could happen if Nephi hadn't killed Laban. Interestingly, at the moment when Laban was lying there, Nephi did not know all of this. All he knew was the Spirit said to kill Laban, and so he did. The lesson is, always obey the Spirit. You just have to make sure you have the Spirit with you. You have to be able to recognize it when it talks to you. So, are we communists? As I thought about the story of Nephi and Laban, I thought, this may just be one of those stories that's a one-off. There may never have been a story like this. Is there a similar story, preferably one that Nephi would have known, so it would have had to have been in the Old Testament, where someone else had to do this? Can you think of a story where somebody took somebody's sword and cut off somebody else's head? There is such a story, the story of David and Goliath. In an interesting study in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, Ben McGuire ties together the stories of Nephi and Goliath. There are basically three elements in the story that are very similar in both stories. 1. Everyone is afraid of the antagonist. 2. The protagonists make a prophecy of the outcome. And 3. The event itself. As David slew Goliath, so Nephi slew his enemy, Laban. There is biblical precedence. So no, we're not communists. This has happened before. The Lord protects our agency. Do we have similar stories today? While we may not have stories where we have to take someone's sword and cut off their heads, we do have stories where we have to follow the Spirit. One of my favorite stories in church history is the story of Brigham and Heber going to England. The first English mission was in 1837, and they met with varied success. After the leaders left, the church began to struggle. In 1839, the Quorum of the 12 was called to return. They struggled to prepare their families so they could be gone for 2 years. Finally, Brigham and Heber were ready to set off, but they and their families became deathly ill. They couldn't even get out of bed to do basic things. They had arranged for a wagon to come and pick them up and start on their journey. Their families were all sick. Heber later wrote, "I went to my bed and shook hands with my wife, who was then shaking with a chill, having 2 children lying sick by her side. I embraced her and my children and bade them farewell. My only well child was little Heber P., and it was with difficulty he could carry a couple of quarts of water at a time to assist in quenching their thirst. It was with difficulty we got into the wagon and started down the hill about 10 rods. It appeared to me as though my very inmost parts would melt within me at leaving my family in such a condition, as it were almost in the arms of death. I felt as though I could not endure it. I asked the teamster to stop and said to Brother Brigham, 'This is pretty tough, isn't it? Let's rise up and give them a cheer.' We arose, and swinging our hats 3 times over our heads, shouted, 'Hurrah! Hurrah for Israel!' Violet, hearing the noise, arose from her bed and came to the door. She had a smile on her face. Violet and Mary Ann Young cried out to us, 'Goodbye, God bless you.' We returned the compliment and then told the driver to go ahead. After this I felt a spirit of joy and gratitude, having had the satisfaction of seeing my wife standing upon her feet instead of leaving her in bed, knowing well that I should not see them again for 2 or 3 years. Within a few months they met the Benbow farm. Hundreds were converted. By June, many of these converts began to emigrate to the United States. From this mission, almost 5,000 saints emigrated to Nauvoo. The days of Nauvoo were trying times. Many left the church. The British saints that Brigham, Heber, and others baptized were integral in helping Nauvoo and the trip west to Salt Lake City. These saints helped to carry the day. Because of their numbers, they were able to make it to Salt Lake and were able to settle the Intermountain West. They were able to build a base so that we could come later and build Zion. Remember, that is our destiny. I'm personally grateful for this mission to Great Britain because I had ancestors at Benbow Farm. Without these episodes, I may not be here today. How do you think Joseph felt when he heard these stories? Was it hard for him to send these people when he didn't know how the story would end? I think Joseph only knew one thing, and that was that the Spirit had asked him to send those men on a mission. So he called them. How do we respond when the Spirit asks things of us? I'd like to close with Doctrine and Covenants, section 64, verses 33 and 34. Wherefore, be not weary in well-doing, for ye are laying the foundation of a great work, and out of small things proceedeth that which is great. Behold, the Lord requireth the heart and a willing mind, and the willing and obedient shall eat the good of the land of Zion in these last days. Sometimes it's the small things, but if we want to be part of Zion, we must have a willing heart and mind. We have to be able to discern the Spirit and be obedient to that word.